Oh, thank you, John. We'll make a few general observations and then proceed to the thanking people for their contributions. So in terms of general observations, if we start with probably the easiest one, the second topic that we discussed was the pass-through of distribution pricing structures. And while there wasn't complete unanimity, I think there was a fairly strong consensus that retailers are going to set their prices to meet what they consider to be their consumers' needs. They're going to be under competitive pressure in making those choices. But that shouldn't preclude the distributors moving on to putting out more cost-reflective and service-based pricing for themselves. And they will be, except with one exception, they will be charging their customers, really their initial customer is of course the retailer. But they have a whole lot of consumers and they have a whole lot of other stakeholders that are out there, and we'll come back to that in a minute to make some observations about that. In terms of strength of incentives, I think there's still a bit of a tension between the central planners and those who think that there's enough incentives in the system as it is. I think that there clearly is incentives around making sure that they don't have inefficient bypass, making sure that they don't unnecessarily undermine their own assets. But there was also a warning shot that the authority needs to keep an eye on. Some of them may have other incentives to some distributors may have other incentives around trying to, in fact, collar particular businesses for themselves using their power. The issue is that one is dealing with distributors who do have a position where they aren't in a workably competitive market, but the yardstick the authority will always use is looking for outcomes that one would expect to get in a workably competitive market. So that that's the market failure that we are concerned potentially about, but we want to see whether, in fact, with our guidelines and so forth, that we can make progress on that. In terms of where to from here and what would success look like and so forth, the authority itself has not really addressed the final picture of that question. It thinks we're on a journey as an industry. But I could put forward some personal suggestions of things that I think would be good for us to have happen in a reasonable time frame. One is, as the authority has already signalled, it's going to look at its pricing principles for distribution pricing in the light of this conversation that the industry is having, and that will be the time frame expected at the moment is early next year for doing that, so we hope to do that. But we also know that the ENA is really working on its own work, and the authority has welcomed that. And my own personal hope is that what the ENA comes up with is not just a long 130-page document, but something that, in a sense, is a bit of a cookbook for distribution companies. A cookbook in this sense of saying if these are the sort of circumstances you are facing in terms of growth, diversity, line network components, capacity constraints, falling demand, those different characteristics that you might be facing, then here is a selection of potential charges that you could use and the rationale for having those particular charges. I have to confess I've drawn this on my own little back of an envelope, so I'm expecting it to come out. And it might be a good way to get that summary document that the board of the ENA, we've been told, is really looking for. Because I think there's a need for some practical guidance, not just about here's the overall theory and so forth, but here's where particular types of charging might be most appropriate. In that context, there will be circumstances, in my view, where carrying on for some time with the current charging regime for some distributors may actually be the optimal. I don't discount that. I don't say it's definitely the case, but I don't discount it. But if one had a range of here's the different sorts of charges and here's where they might be suitable and here's where they might be unsuitable, that would be really, I think, helpful to carry it on. And given the state at which I think the ENA is at, of 2 or 3 weeks away, one would certainly hope that one's seeing that within the next 6 months or so, if not sooner, along those lines. So again, early next year. The questions that were raised about what we would think is success and about the question of why and the need for a narrative in relation to that. My quick answer to that is that I think that the authority in its November 2015 paper and its summary gave a very clear explanation as to why distribution pricing needs to be more cost-effective and service-based. Now, it will need repeating and it will need refining over time. We have repeated it on several occasions. I even repeated it this morning. And it will need to be repeated continuously, but I think the question of why is there. Now, the audience of this group have probably picked it up and have it. I think there's a wider group than this that have that. There's many significant and important journalists in our sector who have got the picture as well, and there are a number of other parties, including politicians, who've got the picture also. And I suspect, and from the correspondence I get, there are also stakeholders more just generally interested in these sort of things out there in the community. But when it comes to changing things, I think that we will continue to need to repeat that, but I think there is actually a storyline there, a storyline that will need refining. And the storyline is not about photovoltaics, it's about technology in total. And there are real issues about introducing and getting the benefits out of batteries. There are real issues about electric vehicles, which we've heard a lot about today. In fact, they are probably more significant, the ones that people focus on, the electric. And if anybody's currently investing in photovoltaics, thinking that there isn't a prospect of change in the charging regime here, well, I think they've not been doing their homework, and one has to wonder whether one should incentivise people not to do homework in terms of those things. So I think that we have been answering that why question. It will need a lot of repeating and it will need people to pick it up. In terms of communicating, it's very clear that the retailers have the end consumers, except in one instance. So that's the general pattern. And they may or may not change their charges if the lines company changes, and they may change at their time. So I think the person from Trustpower probably had the right summary of where it should be at, in my view, that the lines companies, when they change over time there to cost-reflective and service-based charges, will need to communicate more generally that they're making a change. But then the retailers, when they make the change for the individual customers, if they make the change, and they will make that choice on the basis, I think, of their views about what customers actually want and what is in their competitive advantage, they will be able to then refer back to those particular changes. So that means that the distributors have to be very careful that they are signalling they're not making changes for end consumers. They're making changes of charges to retailers, except in one instance, unless you want to unwind that model, which has been agreed by most of the parties of an interpose rather than a conveyance model. So distributors will be making changes in pricing to retailers. So they shouldn't be making announcements that they're making changes in prices to customers. But talking to stakeholders about what they're doing to those retailers will provide, I think, an important background, but it's going to need, I think, here to not communicate those issues. So I think there are a few of the observations I'd make. I'd like to thank all of the speakers who have contributed to giving sessions here. I think they've all been very interesting and all brought their own particular perspectives. I'd also like to thank all of those who have contributed from the floor. It's not always easy in these sort of discussions to have a dialogue, but I think from my perspective, this has been very useful. I've sat at the back of the room observing what's going on, and I think the industry is making, on today, has made the sort of progress I'd hoped to make. So let's hope we continue along that sort of progress. Finally, the last word, of course, has to go to, the second final word, actually, has to go to Molly. I am now at the point, as you know, where I've got my Super Gold card, so my memory is failing me. But I can recall about 6 weeks ago reading a very interesting piece of research that they were working on in the market monitoring sector, which had not actually looked at individual customers because you weren't able to track the ICP, but had looked at income levels in mesh blocks, along with ICPs in mesh blocks, and had looked at price elasticity, and had come up with a result that was as you would expect, that relatively low price elasticity rising, and then after a certain point people get so much money they don't give us stuff. So rises then falls. Now that's my memory of it. I'd have to say the staff don't seem to have the same memory, but the one I talk to, everything we do in the end ends up in the public arena. We have done other work on price elasticity, and that work which we have published, which shows higher price elasticities than most people assume. So yes, at least some boffin in our bowels has been thinking following your lead, Molly, without knowing that you were thinking about it. I think my memory may be fading. So final things, thank you very much, John, for leading the charge. Much more successfully done than I'd have to say the New Zealand swimming team at the Olympics Games performed, but we'll work on that subsequently. Thank you.